Nobody warned Jasper Tull that the woman climbing down off the Sweetwater stage had never once in her 32 years given a room full of doubting men the satisfaction of watching her break. She came to Sweetwater Flats, Texas, in the hard white heat of a July that had already driven 2 wells dry and cracked the pasture earth into a pattern of shallow plates. Her name was Prudence Vance. She went by Prue, had since she was 7 years old, and decided that Prudence was too long a name for someone who had so many other things to get done. She stepped off that stage with a canvas bag in one hand and a leather-bound ledger tucked under her other arm, and she stood in the street while the dust settled and looked at the town the way a carpenter looked at a warped door, quietly, thoroughly, deciding where to start. The Tull Ranch was 4 miles out past the Mercantile and the Baptist church, through mesquite scrub and bunchgrass gone pale from drought. A boy named Levi, maybe 17, gap-toothed and ropey-muscled, drove the wagon that came to collect her. He said maybe a dozen words on the way out, which suited her fine. She spent the drive looking at the land and making notes in her ledger that no one had asked her to make. She counted the fence posts that needed replacing. She noted the dried creek bed, the position of the windmill, the way the kitchen garden beside the main house had been left to go entirely to seed. A sorry tangle of dead tomato stakes and cracked soil where someone had once long ago planted with intention. She wrote it all down without comment. There'd be time for comment later. 3 of the ranch hands were gathered near the barn when the wagon rolled in. Clyde was the one who spoke first. He was the kind of man who always spoke first, lean and sun-darkened with a narrow mouth that moved faster than his brain reliably could. He didn't look at her face when he said it. He looked at the rest of her, that slow, sideways look she'd been receiving since she was 19 and had stopped expecting anything better from strangers. Jasper said he was hiring a cook. He said it to the man beside him, not to her. Didn't mention he was hiring 1.5. The man beside him laughed, short and reflexive. The third hand had the grace to find something pressing to study about the toe of his boot. Prue set her bag down on the wagon bench and looked at Clyde with the flat, unhurried attention she reserved for moments exactly like this one. She'd spent enough years in enough kitchens to know that the first few seconds mattered more than the first few weeks. Let a man think you'd swallowed the insult quietly and he'd keep handing them to you. Let him know you'd heard it clearly and were deciding what to do about it, and the math changed. "You must be Clyde," she said. He blinked. "How'd you know?" Didn't. She picked up her bag. But a man who says something like that when a stranger first arrives is always named something like Clyde. The man studying his boot made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but wanted to be. Clyde's expression sharpened. Before he found whatever he was reaching for, the front door of the ranch house opened and a man came out. Jasper Tull was not what she'd built from his 2 letters. He was younger than his writing, which had been economical to the point of terseness. Just the facts, just the terms, not a syllable wasted on courtesy. In person he was broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had clearly decided years ago it wasn't in the business of expressing anything that hadn't been carefully considered first. He crossed the yard with the unhurried walk of a man who owned every inch of it. "Miss Vance," he said. "Mr. Tull." She'd already moved past him to look at the kitchen garden. "What happened to your beds?" He stopped. "Excuse me?" "The garden." She nodded toward the dry tangle of stakes and dead vines. "Somebody planted it once. Whoever they were, they knew what they were doing, laid it out proper, good drainage. When did it stop being tended?" Jasper was quiet for a moment. "My wife passed 4 years ago." Prue looked at him directly then and kept her voice level. "I'm sorry for that. I'm going to need access to the well and the seed store before the week's out." He studied her the same careful way she studied him, not with malice, just with the quiet calculation of a man trying to figure out what he was actually dealing with. "All right," he said after a moment. "You want to see the kitchen first?" "I already know what the kitchen looks like," she said. "Same as every kitchen on every working ranch I've ever walked into where there's been no woman in it for 4 years. Let me guess. The stovepipe's clogged, the flowers got weevils, and somebody's left a cast iron in a bucket of standing water long enough to rust the seasoning off." Jasper's jaw moved. "The pan's more of an orange color than it used to be." "I'll fix it," Prue said and picked up her bag. She was right about all of it. The stovepipe was half blocked with old grease and the ghost of a bird's nest that had come down from above. The flour had weevils. The cast iron had gone the color of old brick. The pantry held enough salt pork and dried beans to keep the men from actual hunger, but nothing else. Nothing that suggested anyone had ever considered the difference between keeping men alive and actually feeding them. She worked through the afternoon without stopping, the way she always had, the way her mother had taught her, and hard experience had reinforced. First the stove, because nothing else mattered without it. Then the rusted pan, which she buried in a bed of coarse salt and set near the heat to draw the moisture out, before she began the slow work of reseasoning it with lard applied in thin coats, one patient layer at a time. By the time the light started slanting gold through the single westward window, she had the beginnings of a supper that was honest instead of punitive, beans cooked long enough to be tender, salt pork rendered down properly, biscuits that rose the way biscuits were supposed to when someone measured the leavening with care. Levi was the first one in, drawn by the smell from clear across the yard. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and his eyes wide. "That smells different," he said. "Smells like someone cooked it," Prue said, without turning from the stove. "Sit down." The rest of the men filed in after. Clyde sat at the far end of the table with the careful posture of a man who hadn't decided yet whether to keep his mouth moving or let the situation develop on its own. Amos, a quiet man in his 50s with a gray beard and the patient eyes of someone who'd survived a great deal by staying out of other people's business, sat across from him and said nothing. Garrett, the youngest after Levi, kept his eyes on his plate in the way of a man hungry enough that politics could wait. Jasper sat at the head and ate without comment. The beans were simple. Prue had done what she could with what was there, a handful of dried herbs she'd found in a crock on the highest shelf, too old to be powerful but not so old they were useless. An onion from the very bottom of a barrel where it had somehow survived. Salt measured correctly, the pork cooked through without being dried out. It was not remarkable food, but it was cooked right, and in a kitchen where nothing had been cooked right in long enough that the men had stopped expecting it. Right was its own kind of revelation. The table went quiet in the way that tables went quiet when the food was better than the conversation deserved. Levi ate 2 full plates without raising his head. Amos finished his biscuit, slowly, the way a man did when he was trying to make something last. Even Garrett, who'd arrived too hungry for dignity, slowed down somewhere in the middle and began to actually taste what he was eating. Clyde ate. He didn't say anything about the food, which was itself a kind of answer. Jasper pushed his plate back at the end and looked at her once, briefly. He said, "Biscuits were good," the way a man said a thing he meant but wasn't sure he was supposed to say out loud. "They'll be better tomorrow," Prue said, already moving to clear. "I need baking powder that isn't 4 years old." Something almost passed across his face. "I'll see to it," he said, and took his coffee out to the porch without further comment. The first 2 weeks moved with the particular rhythm Prue had learned to build in every new kitchen, methodical, unhurried. One problem solved before the next one was looked at directly. She cleared the pantry and made her list. She found the kitchen garden's old irrigation channel, still in working order beneath the blown-in dust, and started clearing it by hand each morning before breakfast. She set tomato seedlings from the general store's last sad box of transplants into the turned earth, and covered them each night with old burlap when the temperature dropped. She learned the men the way she'd always learned the men she fed. Levi was easy, young enough to be grateful out loud, curious about everything, and still in possession of the open decency that years of hard ranch work hadn't yet worn down to a stub. He started helping her carry water for the garden without being asked, mostly because she hadn't treated him like furniture the way most adults did. Amos kept to himself but ate everything she put in front of him with quiet attention, and once, when she was carrying a loaded pot to the table alone, stood up and took it from her without ceremony and set it down himself. He didn't make anything of it. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated a compliment. Clyde was the problem, as she'd known from that first day he would be. Not because he was cruel by nature. She'd met men who were, and he wasn't that. He was simply the kind of man who'd spent his whole life getting small laughs at other people's expense, and had never once been made to reckon with the cost of it. He didn't know any other way to fill a silence. It came to a head on a Wednesday, the kind of hot afternoon that turned the air above the pasture into a shimmer and kept everyone short-tempered. Prue had been working in the garden since before breakfast and had come inside to start the midday meal with her hair damp at the temples and her apron stained with good, honest soil. She was at the stove when Clyde came through the back door and stopped in the doorway. "Lord," Prue. He said it to the room, not specifically to her, which was its own particular cowardice. You been out rolling in the garden again? Wondering how the ground holds up under all that? Amos looked at his hands. Garrett found the middle distance. Levi's expression went from easy to careful in the space of a breath. Prue took the skillet off the heat. She set it on the iron trivet on the counter. She wiped her hands on the towel tucked in her apron strings, and then she turned around. She didn't raise her voice. That was the thing about raised voices. They gave men like Clyde exactly what they were looking for. Proof that they'd gotten under your skin. She gave him none of that. I've been cooking your breakfast, your dinner, and your supper for 2 weeks, she said. I've seasoned that cast iron back from the dead and put a garden in out there that'll have this ranch eating its own vegetables before September, instead of paying mercantile prices for carrots that came off a wagon 3 days ago. I've done all of it without complaint and without anyone asking me to. She held his gaze steady, not aggressive, just thoroughly unwilling to move. Now, is there anything about my work you want to speak to? Or were you just planning to keep making comments about my body? Clyde opened his mouth. Because if it's the second one, Prue continued, you can eat your supper cold. The kitchen was very quiet. Levi was looking at her with something that might have been admiration. Amos had the expression of a man who was very privately satisfied with how the last 30 seconds had gone. Clyde closed his mouth. His ears went red. He sat down. Didn't mean anything by it, he muttered to the table rather than to her. I know you didn't, Prue said, and meant it honestly. That was the truth of men like him. They rarely meant anything by it. That was exactly why they kept doing it. They'd never been required to mean anything by it. Supper'll be ready in 20 minutes. She turned back to the stove. Jasper was in the doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there, but the look on his face told her it had been long enough. He held her eyes for a moment, then looked at Clyde with a particular look that didn't require words because all the words were already in it. Clyde found something urgent to do out by the barn. Jasper said nothing to her, but that evening, after the hands had scattered and she was finishing the dishes, she heard his boots on the kitchen floor and turned to find him setting a paper-wrapped parcel on the counter. New baking powder, he said, and some dried chiles from Muller's. Thought they might be useful. She looked at the parcel, then at him. Thank you, Jasper. He'd started using her name sometime in the second week. Prue, not Miss Vance, and she'd noticed because he said it the way careful men said things, like he'd thought about it first, like it was a decision, not a reflex. Clyde's not a bad man, Jasper said, still standing there in the way he had of standing in rooms, like he was deciding whether he was needed or not. No, Prue agreed. He's just a man who's never been told there's a cost to that kind of talk. He'll learn. She set the baking powder on the shelf. Are you telling me to go easy on him? No, Jasper said. I'm telling you he'll be better for it. She allowed herself a small smile at that, just a corner of one, turned back toward the counter so he wouldn't catch it. Sit down if you're staying, she said. There's coffee. He sat. It was the first time he'd stayed in the kitchen past the meal, without a pretext of ranch business to justify it. The garden came in with the stubbornness of things that had been given proper care after a long drought. By mid-August, Prue had tomatoes. She had pole beans strung up on the replaced stakes. She had a row of sweet onions that had no business doing as well as they were doing in July soil, but doing it anyway, and she chose to take that as a personal compliment. She told Jasper they could stop buying vegetables from the mercantile entirely by September, and watched the quiet arithmetic of a man revising his monthly costs move across his face. That's not nothing, he said. No, she agreed, it's not. He started coming out to the garden in the early mornings, sometimes, before the hands were up, on the pretext of checking the windmill at the garden's far edge. She didn't call him on the pretext. She just handed him a hoe when he got close enough, and he took it without complaint and worked beside her in the early quiet that belonged to people who were up before the rest of the world had decided what kind of day it was going to be. He told her, in pieces and only in the mornings, about the ranch. About the years since his wife had died, when it had gone from a place with a shape to a place that was merely surviving. About the way the men had started eating fast and joyless in a kitchen that smelled like nothing at all, and drifting into town on their days off to eat at the diner where at least the pie was someone's idea of effort. They don't go into town for supper anymore, Prue said one morning, not looking up from the bean row she was checking. I noticed, Jasper said. Levy said last week he doesn't see the point. Said he'd rather eat what's here. She moved along the row. That's not nothing either. Jasper was quiet a moment. No, he said, it's not. There was a county social at the end of August. The kind of thing that happened in small Texas towns where the calendar was marked by heat and cattle prices, and the rare occasion when people had a reason to put on their better clothes. Jasper mentioned it one evening in passing, without particular emphasis. You should come, he said. Prue looked up from her ledger. She'd been keeping the household accounts now in addition to the garden notes, because Jasper had asked her to look at the supply spending, and she'd found 3 places within the first hour where money was walking quietly out the door. To the social. You've been here 6 weeks, he said. Haven't been to town once. Haven't needed to. Still, he set down his coffee cup. I'd like it if you came. She looked at him steadily. He looked back with the flat, honest patience she'd come to understand was as close as he got to an open door. Jasper, she said, people in town are going to look at me. People in town look at everybody. You know what I mean. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I know what you mean. I'll be standing right there. She went. The social was in the churchyard, long tables set under the live oaks. The women of Sweetwater Flats arranged along the food tables in a hierarchy of pies that had been established long before Prue had arrived in the county. She stood beside Jasper in the open and felt the exact weight of attention she'd predicted, the way it moved through a crowd, sidelong and never direct, always with the particular cruelty of being discussed rather than addressed. She caught pieces of it, not all, enough. The banker's wife, standing with 2 other women near the lemonade table, wasn't talking quietly enough. Something about what Jasper Tull was thinking, something about a wonder she could keep up with the ranch work. Prue had been in that moment before. She knew the way it usually went, shoulders up, chin level, the old practice stillness, outlast it until the attention moved on. She'd done it every time. It worked, in the way that endurance always worked, at a cost. What she was not expecting was for Jasper to take the 3 steps that put him directly in front of those women, without raising his voice or changing his expression in any way that could be called heated. Ladies, he said. The banker's wife recovered first. She had the composure that came from long practice at being above reproach. Jasper, lovely evening. It is, he said. I wanted to come over and introduce you to Prue properly, since it sounds like you've been discussing her. He didn't soften it. He didn't dress it up. He just said it plain, with no apology built in. This is Prudence Vance. She's been running my ranch's kitchen and household for the past 6 weeks, and in that time she's rebuilt the kitchen garden from nothing, brought the supply costs down enough that I had money to fix the north pasture fence I've been putting off for 2 years, and made my hands start showing up to supper on time for the first time since my wife passed. I thought you'd like to know who you were talking about. The banker's wife opened her mouth and found it empty. Jasper turned to Prue, and for a moment the social and the live oaks and the long evening light all seemed to arrange themselves around just the 2 of them. There's apple cake on the table, he said, without any ceremony at all. You mentioned you'd been thinking about apple cake. She had mentioned it 3 days ago, to no one in particular, while looking at the sad state of the ranch's single apple tree. He'd been across the yard, he'd heard it anyway, and he'd remembered. Let's go find it, she said. August tilted into September. The tomatoes came in heavy, and Prue put up 30 jars of them in 3 days, her arms aching in the particular way that came from good hard work and didn't bother her because she knew what it was for. Levi helped with the lifting and earned the right to eat the tomato she peeled fresh off the vine and handed to him, still warm from the afternoon sun. He bit into it like it was something sacred and looked at her with the uncomplicated gratitude of someone who had genuinely never thought about where food came from before and was only now beginning to understand. Clyde had changed, not dramatically, not all at once, the way real change rarely went. He'd simply become quieter around her. He ate what she put in front of him and said, "Thank you" at the end of meals, the kind of thank you calibrated to cost something rather than slide out of habit. One afternoon she found 24 eggs collected from the henhouse and left on the kitchen counter with no note. Clyde was the only one who'd been near the chickens that day. She made a cake. He ate 3 slices and said nothing about it. She counted that as a full accounting settled. It was at the supper table in late September that the last thing finally got said out loud. Prue had made chicken stew, slow-cooked, properly seasoned, with dumplings that had come out light in a way that still surprised her, despite having made them 100 times, because good cooking always carried something unreliable and wonderful in it. The table was quiet with the specific reverence men reserved for food that asked something of them in return for what it offered. It was Levi who broke the quiet first, the way Levi usually did, because he was the only one at that table young enough to say what everyone else was thinking without calculating the cost of it. "This is the best thing I've ever eaten in my whole entire life," he announced through a mouthful of dumpling, which earned him a look from Amos and a laugh from Garrett, and did nothing to dim his expression of total sincerity. Prue allowed herself the satisfaction of it without making a show. She'd learned long ago that the trick to this kind of work wasn't announcing your victories. It was letting the proof sit on the table and speak for itself, course after course, meal after meal, until even the hardest skeptics stopped finding reasons to doubt. But it was Clyde, of all people, who surprised her. He'd been quiet through most of the meal, quieter than his new usual, and she'd noticed without drawing attention to it. When his plate was empty, he set down his fork and looked at the table rather than at her, the way men looked when they were about to say something that cost them something real. "I said some things when you first got here," he said. He stopped, started again. "About you. That weren't right. I knew they weren't right when I was saying them, and I said them anyway, which is about the worst version of a thing a man can do." He looked up, finally, and met her eyes directly. "I'm sorry for it, Prue. Straight out, no conditions. I'm sorry." The table had gone still. Levi's eyes were wide. Amos had the expression of a man watching something he hadn't expected to be proud of. Garrett stared at his plate with the focused attention of someone respecting a private moment. Prue felt something tighten in her throat, unexpected and sudden, the accumulated weight of years of similar judgments suddenly meeting, in this one ordinary kitchen in Sweetwater Flats, Texas, an actual reckoning instead of silence. "Thank you, Clyde," she said, and her voice was steady. "That means more than you probably know." "Means it," he said gruffly and picked up his coffee cup. "The stew's real good." The table exhaled. Conversation came back in slowly, easy and warm, and Prue turned back to the stove before anyone could see what was moving through her face. Not grief exactly, not joy exactly, just the particular fullness of a moment where something long owed had finally been paid. It was later that night, after the kitchen had gone quiet, and the hands had scattered to their bunks, that Jasper stayed at the table. His ledger was open, but his pencil was still, and she'd been working around him the way she'd grown accustomed to working around him. Easy, without friction, the way you moved around something that had become part of the room. "Prue," he said. When you came here in July," he stopped, started again. "I told myself I needed a cook, somebody to keep the kitchen running and the men fed. That's what I wrote in the letter, and that's what I thought I was asking for." She dried her hands on the kitchen towel and turned around, because she understood from the particular quality of silence he was using that this was the kind of thing deserving a person's full attention. "What I got," he said, "was someone who looked at my ranch the way I'd stopped being able to look at it, like it was worth something. Like the garden mattered, like the way the men were eating mattered, like whether the books balanced right mattered." He looked at her steadily from across the table, the lamplight catching the silver at his temples. "You didn't have to do any of that. The letter didn't ask for it." "I know it didn't," Prue said. "Why did you?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because a place worth saving is worth saving all the way," she said. "Not just the kitchen, all of it." She folded the towel over the rack. "I've walked into a lot of kitchens in my life, Jasper. You can tell within 20 minutes whether the people who live in a house have given up on it or whether they just ran out of hands. This one hadn't given up. It had just run out of hands." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a nighthawk called once from somewhere over the pasture, and the stove settled with a low, comfortable sound. "I'd run out of hands," he said finally, "and I'd run out of the ability to care about it the way I used to." He looked at her with the directness he brought to everything that mattered to him. No deflection, no softening of the edges. "You gave it back. That's not a small thing." Prue felt the weight of years of kitchens and contracts and careful proving settle into something different in her chest, something lighter. "It's not a small thing for me either," she said. "Having a place where the work I do is the measure. Not," she stopped, revised, "not other measurements." He stood up from the table then and crossed the kitchen in the unhurried way. He crossed every room he owned and stopped close enough that she could see the steady resolve in his face. Not the look of a man making a calculation, but one who'd finished making it and was ready to say what he'd found. "I don't think about other measurements," he said, in case that wasn't clear. "It's getting clearer," she said. He reached out and took her hand in his rough, weather-worked, unhesitating, and held it with the same care he brought to things he intended to keep. The fire in the stove burned low and steady. Outside, the first real stars of October had come out over the hill country, and the ranch that had spent 4 years barely surviving had the quiet, settled feeling of a place now doing something more deliberate. The garden rows were mulched for the season. The pantry was full. The 30 jars of tomatoes stood in their careful line on the cellar shelf, red and still in the lamplight, proof of work that would carry all the way through the winter ahead. Prue looked at the man across from her, this plain-spoken, deliberate man who had not once, in all the weeks since she'd stepped off that stage with her canvas bag and her ledger and her total absence of apology, looked at her the way the town had, or the way Clyde had on that first afternoon. He had only looked at her the way you looked at something you were beginning to understand the full value of, and she thought about the letter she'd almost not answered. The one that had sat on her cousin's table in Missouri for 2 days while she'd told herself she wasn't the kind of woman ranchers wrote letters to. She'd been wrong about that. She'd been wrong about a number of things, it turned out, when she'd allowed other people's estimates of her to do her thinking for her. She wasn't going to make that mistake again. "I'm going to need to extend the garden in the spring," she said. "Another 20 feet on the east side at least, if we're serious about not depending on the mercantile for onions." Jasper's hand tightened slightly around hers. "We're serious," he said. Outside, the October wind moved through the mesquite in the low, unhurried way of something with all winter to make itself understood, and inside the kitchen, the lamp burned on steady and warm over a table, where someone had finally stopped keeping careful track of how much room she was allowed to take up, and had simply begun at last to take it.